Hi, thank you for clicking on this video. Today, we'll be talking about female empowerment and Caribbean music. I was compelled to make this video for two reasons really. The first came to me a while back when I was watching this video on Vice about Who Let the Dogs Out, backstory, and I'll link it in the description. But they kind of go through these different pop culture phenomena in history and they go behind the scenes, and so this was one of those videos. And the song's original writer, Anselm Douglas, explained that how the lyrics were originally supposed to be a diss directed at letchy men being thirsty towards women in the dance.
So the lyric to the song is, the party was nice, the party was pumping, and everybody was having a ball. Till them man start their name calling, and the girls respond to the call. I hear a woman shout out, "Who let the dogs out?" So I just used it from there and said, you know what, this is going to be a revenge song where women tell men, "Look, get away from me, you're a dog." And she went on to say, "Last year in the dance, you had a ball. Call me Millibug and Skettel. Get back, Fluffy, mash Fluffy. Get back, you flea-infested mongrel. Who let the dogs out?" And Millibug is actually an insect that was attacking fruit trees. Now, a Skettel is, it's a woman who you would not take home to mommy. Let's just leave it at that. And that slang, Skettel, was everywhere. It was just degrading women and calling them all sorts of derogatory names. And I tried to do a social commentary as a party song, but the party song overshadowed the social commentary aspect of it.
Lyrics with this part correctional, part comical, part insulting tone, think picong, are pretty key actually. They come up a lot in Caribbean lyrics across different genres in the region. And even the darkest of themes can get missed if all you're focusing on is whining, which, you know, no blame, no shame. It's just, you might have missed this. So with the second reason, I've been recently reading When Chickenheads Come Home to Roost, which was written by Joan Morgan in 1999. And for me, the parallels between that and what I'm going to discuss today are impossible to ignore. I've nearly finished, I've got it here. There's like less than 100 pages left. But essentially, it goes over the working class backdrop of hip hop, the time period. Hip hop and dancehall were emerging at the same time as one another, and actually they were emerging from the same root as one another as well. And it turns out the writer is even of Jamaican heritage, having been born there in 1965 and moving over to the States as a child. Crucially, it describes some of the conflict that a black woman might have being a fan of hip hop, or in my case, and what I'm talking about today, of Caribbean music, because of the misogyny that's present in the lyrics and also in the culture surrounding it. But she also isn't afraid to challenge the alienation and misunderstanding of black working class women within white, feminist, middle class, mainstream spaces. So it's a really enjoyable book and I do recommend it. In the meantime, this inspired me to make this video talking about how female issues present in Caribbean music. It is something that is, in my view, often completely glossed over, at the very least misunderstood, especially outside of the region. If you're familiar with any Caribbean music genres, you'll know that heavy topics are actually not that uncommon, despite the sort of sometimes deceptively cheery or upbeat production, right? So things like child poverty, poverty in general, injustice, child abuse, corruption, all kinds, violence, all kinds of different types of themes are covered in Caribbean music. And so issues facing women, like disproportionately high rates of domestic violence and femicide, are also no strangers in Caribbean music. But a quick disclaimer before I start. I am not an expert by any means. I am just someone who has a real interest in this type of thing and has done some research and done some reading. In fact, I encourage you to check out my sources. I put them in every video of mine because the points that I'm making go into much more depth in those sources, much more than I could ever cover in a short YouTube video. So please take a look at those in your own time. So with that out of the way, let me provide you with some cultural and historical context in gender dynamics in the Caribbean. Dynamics in the Caribbean have been shaped by a range of influences from indigenous cultures, African and European cultures, and Asian traditions. During slavery, both genders worked side by side doing hard labour in the plantations, and they also worked together in slavery resistances and rebellions. However, there were some gender-specific tasks for women, like certain domestic tasks. Enslaved African women were also sexually exploited and abused for the gratification of male slave owners. Enslaved people were largely not in a position to have monogamous relationships with one another, and so you would frequently find both men and women having several children by different people. Unless the father was a slave owner, mothers were the only formally recognised parents. In the British West Indies, marriage was prohibited among enslaved people until the end of the 1700s. Even once restrictions were lifted, people didn't necessarily take up the newly found ability to get married. After abolition, African male labourers became more transient and they travelled around for work, often leaving the women behind with their families. Despite earlier participation in slave resistance, African women were left out of politics, and so they either remained on the plantations or they took up jobs such as dressmaking or being maids, etc., etc., etc. In the lead up to emancipation, the British viewed the male-headed nuclear family as a force to civilise the population in preparation for their impending freedom. And so they started pushing for people to legitimise their unions in Protestant churches. One example of this is the Baptist mass marriage campaign in Jamaica. Interestingly enough, this isn't the last time that this happened. As recently as 1944/1945, there was a mass marriage campaign in Jamaica as well. This morally conservative, Victorian middle-class ideology has parallels with a similar and related phenomenon happening back in England, as poor mothers were framed as reckless, feckless and neglectful of their children. More on motherhood later, actually. Despite all of this, marriage rates still didn't increase significantly in the region, but it did set it up as a social ideal. And it was a form of social mobility for African lower-class women pursuing respectability. As of today, legal marriage is still the least common form of union, despite how socially conservative the Caribbean is. This is largely determined by social class, however. So, for example, in Anglophone nations, English-speaking nations, which is actually what I'm going to be focusing on today, although there are broad similarities across the whole region, women who are in their teens to mid-20s, early mid-20s, are far more likely to be in what's referred to as a visiting union, which is where the couple live separately from one another, with or without shared children, and the woman tends to be financially independent from her partner. Then as she gets a bit older, so, entering, let's say, going into her mid-20s, into her 30s, possibly into her 40s, you then start seeing more common law marriages, which is a cohabiting couple, and these are usually a bit more traditional, actually, in structure, where the male is the head of the household and provides financially for the family. But working class people tend to marry once they are past childbearing age and are more financially stable. This is in contrast to middle class people who marry and marry young. The gender roles are traditional, the male is at the head of the household, but they are also both expected to work, etc., etc. Essentially, traditional gender roles are the norm in these relationships. Class, race, and colorism play a massive role in what ends up determining social class. Middle-class women tend to be either lighter-skinned or not black, and are expected to be stereotypically ladylike, so they're not supposed to swear, they're not supposed to use the whichever their nation's Creole or patois might be, it's kind of frowned upon in their circles, and they're meant to present as demure and modest and respectable. Lower class women, on the other hand, tend to be darker skinned, and they can be louder and more vivacious, and they can and almost always do use their nation's Creole, and they can and do live independently from men. For both classes, however, gender differences show up during childhood. So girls are raised more strictly than boys, and they're expected to do more in the home, whereas boys are actually encouraged to do their thing outside of the home. Girls are taught to be independent and resourceful and know how to stand up for themselves, whereas boys are encouraged to go out and explore sexually. Girls would be really severely punished for doing so. Finally, the vast majority of people in the region are raised in observant Christian households, and often quite devoutly Christian households. So remember how I mentioned motherhood earlier? Motherhood is a central part of womanhood in the Caribbean. In fact, it might in some cases supersede the marital role. To raise well-behaved and successful children is a woman's greatest pride and purpose. Now, going back to the slavery era, because sadly, of course, African families were seen as innately dysfunctional by Europeans. Most African traditions did not survive, and those that did were demonized. Traditional and original African cultures actually placed mothers on a pedestal and saw them as the heart of the family and the giver of life. However, for Europeans, Africans were icons of deviance in European art, and within scientific racism, African sexuality, black sexuality, was viewed as insatiable, which legitimized sexual violence perpetrated against enslaved people, especially women. African women were labeled as Jezebels. African mothers were framed as having no natural maternal instincts and were spoken about in very dehumanizing ways. This is in stark and related. These two roles cannot exist without one another. The white middle-class woman being seen as the pinnacle of femininity and chastity and purity, which needed to be protected at all costs. I've already mentioned the push in the region towards traditional Victorian gender roles and the fact that most of these things were not accessible one way or another to lower class Afro-Caribbeans. This meant that unmarried couples and their children were seen as the source of all social ills in the region, and this continued long after emancipation. Lower class black women were stigmatized, and it was seen that the only way that they could contribute to society was by being humble, loving, and devoted mothers, with middle class women dictating what good parenting consisted of. So, how does this all reflect in the music? Well, we'll take a look today at two examples from Anglophone Caribbean music, Calypso and Dancehall. So, Calypso was born out of a unique set of circumstances. Following the French Revolution, there was a wave of migration from neighbouring French colonies into Trinidad, and with them they brought carnival traditions. Enslaved and indentured people were not allowed to take part in carnival, and so they created one of their own, Camboulé, the term coming from the original French term. During Camboulé, a ritual known as calendar took place, which consisted of singing, dancing, and stick fighting. Chantwells, or griots, who are often but not always female, would lead in singing songs known as kaisos or carisos. And this would be in the traditional African call and response style, and it would also accompany traditional African belay drumming. These songs were often satirical in nature, mocking plantation owners and riling up the rival fighters enough to the point where their fighting would eventually commence. Stick fighting and traditional drumming were eventually banned in 1881, but traditional drumming made a return in 1937 in Trinidad with an orchestra of frying pans and steel pans, which gave birth to the steel pan tradition, which is a key and central and iconic feature of Trini music up until today. From 1845 onwards, indentured immigrants from Asia brought their traditions, which eventually evolved into chutney music. Infusion with European instruments and influence from jazz in the early 20th century gave rise to what we now see as modern calypso music. So, while traditional songs originally centered the praise and worship that was led by West African women, post-slavery it was the men who emerged as the leads of calypso. Bands consisted of lower-class men and women from the underworld, referred to as jamettes, with dancers being scantily clad women dancing provocatively. Songs continued to be subversive in nature, and they were often obscene, continuing to mock authorities. However, theories around the transition from it going from being female-centric to male-dominated explore the idea that in post-slavery society, working-class and lower-class Afro-Trini men were trying and failing to live up to the bourgeois ideals of the time, and so being marginalized and disadvantaged in the post-slavery society, they created this sort of machismo fantasy world instead. Additionally, it was a time of great social change in the 40s as America was setting up naval bases all over the Caribbean, including Trinidad, which gave rise to tourism and prostitution. Up until then, Calypso had focused on local themes like politics, but with the new American fans not being able to get the references, they moved towards something more universally understood, sex. As this established itself, women became the butt of these lyrics. So Afro-Trini women were framed as deceptive, sexually loose, disloyal. East Indian Trini women were framed as sexually naive, unattainable, and something worth bragging about if seduced. And white and light-skinned women were completely off limits because of their social privilege. During its early development, Calypso was spreading throughout the Anglophone West Indies into the United States, as people had been migrating constantly between the two regions since during slavery. In 1963, Calypso Rose became popular in Trinidad and Tobago with her song Cooperation, and when she won her first Calypso Crown title that same year, she became the first to break into a scene that had up until that point been exclusively male. It was seen as improper for women to work as entertainers at the time, but as far as Calypso Rose was concerned, it had always been a part of the culture for women to take part in, dating back to their African roots. A star ever since, her music has covered topics like equal rights, domestic violence, exploitation, infidelity, and everyday life as a working class woman. One of her most recent releases was 2018's Leave Me Alone, featuring Michelle Montano and Manu Chao, the lyrics calling out street harassment commonly faced by women. From the 70s to the 90s, you had the likes of Singing Francis, Singing Diane, Lady Jane, Bernadette Paul, and Singing Sandra come through to further raise the profile of women's issues in Trinidad and Tobago. These women often sang for women and offered their music as a way of support and solidarity along class, race, and gender lines. The 90s is when we see Calypso become more racially diverse in Trinidad, with female artists of mixed and Indian descent appearing as well. In Barbados, we meet one of the genre's most successful artists, Alison Hinds. Rising in popularity during the 90s, in 2005 she released Roll It Gal, which you've probably heard of. It's probably one of her most famous tracks. However, if you're not familiar, the lyrics encourage female listeners to look after and take pride in themselves generally. Her songs have a theme of calling women to dance provocatively, to waka and wine and other such behaviour that invariably becomes a conservative talking point in the lead up to crop over. Bearing in mind, this is a style of dance that is often learned and popularised in the school playground, but it is taboo to do in certain spaces, particularly in front of the opposite sex. Hinds and other singers like Destra or Sanel Dempster dismiss these pleasantries entirely and call the women to do what they need to do, and they call them to do it provocatively and competitively, and they challenge the men to keep up. Modern Jamaican music derives from, ultimately, among other sources, mento, which was performed by enslaved Africans on the island. During this time, music was used as a means of cryptic communication and was a key element in organising and rising up in the push towards emancipation. Mento was African in origin, but it had influences from European music with the introduction of instruments like quadrilles, and people often performed for their slave masters. Post-emancipation, the genre evolved over time into Mento Calypso, Jamaica's first homegrown commercially popular genre. Mento Calypso bands performed live, and lyrics were usually playful takes on current social issues. The 1940s and 50s saw a move away from live music and towards electronic music, with sound systems dominating. While the upper middle classes were partying to the likes of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones out in the suburbs, the working classes were listening to ska in dance halls in downtown Kingston. Ska lyrics originally typically covered romantic themes, but with the social and political climate at the time, and with Jamaica gaining independence in 1962, lyrics took a shift towards politics as well. By the end of the decade, rocksteady and eventually reggae had established themselves. Reggae primarily explored pro-blackness, the Rastafari movement to which many artists belonged, capitalism, politics, and the idealization of Africa. Reggae was an international hit and was the most popular genre in the 70s in Jamaica. The 80s saw another shift towards neoliberalism globally, with the likes of Thatcher, Reagan, and Siaga. Additionally, Jamaica's high levels of poverty and social disparity continue to be unresolved issues since emancipation. With all this, we see a move away from roots music and towards more worldly matters: sex, crime, material wealth, and the realities of living in the ghetto. Where music had typically looked outwards and towards a promised Africa of the future, this new style of music was more inward focused and very much focused on the here and now. So, throughout Jamaica's music history, male artists have reigned supreme. Much can be said and has already been said about the misogynistic and highly sexually explicit lyrics where people are talking about how much gal them have, how much stamina they have in the bedroom. In fact, if you're unfamiliar, this might be the one thing that you do know about Jamaican music besides possibly the homophobia. And Jamaican music is not without its issues. However, there is this tendency to sort of reduce women in the region as having no autonomy whatsoever, as being completely subjugated, and there is no complexity really offered to them. There are a lot of conclusions drawn about them, and particularly because women tend not to necessarily identify as feminist. People might actually disagree with the label of feminist. So outside observers judge that accordingly without necessarily understanding the ins and outs. There is also a tendency to gloss over one of the most important aspects of dancehall, which is it doesn't really exist without the women who participate in it and sometimes dominate. The glory years of reggae that preceded the development of dancehall barely featured women either on stage or in the lyrics. While the surrounding culture was far less sexually objectifying, women were very much in the background. In dancehall, however, this is subverted in many ways, and women have always been a focal point one way or another, be it in the lyrics, the performers, or the people you hope will show up to your dance and buy tickets to liven it up. It's not an event if there are not women there. You've almost certainly heard of Sister Nancy because she's famous for the much sampled Bam Bam. But what you might not know is that she was probably the first DJ for a sound system back in 1977. This is a big deal. People like Lady Saw and Tanya Stephens, two of Jamaica's most successful female artistes, regularly feature themes of telling men what they will and won't do in the bedroom, as well as challenging the machismo and sexual prowess of these men. Remember what I said earlier about gender dynamics in the Caribbean and how the ideal is to be demure, light-skinned, middle class, and only speak proper? Well, these women's presence, no, these women's dominance on centre stage was a lot more of a big deal than people outside the region can appreciate. On top of all of this, as well as explicit lyrics, women will often explore usually quite marginalised subjects, like in Lady Saw's No Less Than a Woman, where she discusses infertility. Then we have dancehall surrounding industries. Take Dancehall Queen, a competition that began in the 90s, where contestants have to excel in a range of things like dancing, fashion and attitude, creating careers for many who end up winning. On the topic of fashion, the many businesses that cater to this specific dancehall aesthetic form a mostly female-dominated industry, creating opportunities for many working-class women and becoming an international phenomenon, inspiring people as far-reaching as Japan. Check out the 1997 movie Dancehall Queen, as it is a decent representation of dancehall fashion as it began in the 90s and actually features people from the scene as well. Moving on from dancehall, remember when I mentioned reggae earlier? Well, I want to come back to that for a second. While traditionally, reggae didn't really have many women artists and didn't discuss gender issues, over the decades this has definitely changed, and even in the very beginnings there were women present. For example, as a teenager, Judy Maarit in 1968 joined a girl group known as the Gaylettes. Later, she began a solo career as one of the only female reggae recording artists at the time. During the 70s, she formed another group with Marcia Griffiths and Rita Marley called the I3s, and they performed as backup for Bob Marley until his death in 1981. During her solo career, Maarit has explored themes of black womanhood, feminism and spirituality. Etana, whose stage name means strength, released her 2014 anthem, Jamaican Woman, celebrating the might of black Jamaican women, and her career centres self-respect and countering negative images of women. Reggae also delves into more harrowing topics. In 2008, Queen Ifrica released her tune, Daddy Don't Touch Me There, in which the lyrics highlight issues around familial child sexual abuse, a deeply taboo and often suppressed subject. In an interview, Queen Ifrica talked about how her work is influenced by the people she's met who have been affected by these things. Around about the same time, Vybz Kartel recorded a track called Rape Her to draw attention to the issue as well, and when talking about its release, he acknowledged how crimes can often go reported due to fear. There has been a trend actually, there's been a tradition of men singing supportive or uplifting songs about women and the issues they deal with. This is not necessarily unusual, with the likes of Fab Five's 80s soca tune, Jamaican Woman, which compliments the many types of women in a benignly humorous way, Tarrus Riley's She's Royal, marvelling at the beauty and majesty of black women, and Sizzler's celebration of black women in Princess Black, to name but a few examples. So I've talked about just some of the themes surrounding gender dynamics in Caribbean music. Anselm Douglas's Doggy, as it was originally called before it came Who Let the Dogs Out, is not unusual in that regard at all. I've only been able to give you some examples from a couple of Anglophone countries. I haven't even begun to be able to go into the range of this topic or the range of the region. However, I hope that this has either introduced you to something interesting or at the very least has given you some ideas of things to add to your playlist. If you liked this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a like. And please check out my other videos because you might find them interesting and end up subscribing. Have a lovely day. Thank you.
You have a clean mouth and your lips them sexy. Treat me like a bottle of Pepsi.
This is filthy, yes. It is very filthy.
Me say equal rights and justice.
How can you sing to it?
Because I've listened to it so many times.